Welcome. I'm Dr. Mike Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's great to see you. Hey, before we begin, I'd like to make a quick but important recognition for some of those in person, but also for those at home. Do we have any World War II veterans, homefront workers, or Holocaust survivors with us this evening? Nope, but let's give them a round of applause anyway. Now, I know this next group is in great demand here tonight. Veterans or active duty members of our armed forces from any era. Would you please stand and be recognized? And if I could, how about family members of any veterans or active duty? I know the Army wife was probably the toughest job in the Army. So spouses or family members, how about please stand and we'll acknowledge you as well. Yeah. Thanks all of you for your service. It makes a difference. I'd also like to recognize our Patriot Circle and charter members of the National World War II Museum that are here this evening. Your support really allows us to put on wonderful programs such as this, and without that, it wouldn't be possible. It gives us a live stream to the folks at home. So Patriot Circle charter members, yep. Thanks you guys, appreciate it. Now we're honored tonight with some of our guests. In the crowd, I'd like to welcome members of the Montford Point Marine Association, New Orleans Chapter 7, and their chapter president, Mr. Jackie Robinson. Marines. Thanks, y'all. And I'd also like to welcome Lieutenant General David Bellin, Commander here in New Orleans of Marine Corps Reserve and Marine Corps Forces South. General, thanks to you and Sue and to the Marines being here this evening. Thanks you very much. Also here tonight, Dr. Marcus Cox, our non-resident fellow at the Institute. Welcome, Dr. Cox. And Dr. Nick Mueller, our President and CEO Emeritus. Nick, thanks as always. Now, continuing with the museum's Black History Month programming, tonight's presentation features a dear friend of the National World War II Museum, Dr. Cameron McCoy. Dr. McCoy is taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point, Brigham Young University, and is currently on the faculty at the United States Air Force Academy. Additionally, Dr. McCoy serves in the Marine Corps Reserve as an infantry officer. He has held various positions of command while serving in various combat tours during Operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom. Now, we got to know Cameron extremely well last summer when he was a participant in our inaugural summer seminar in military history, a 3-week intensive program for 20 young PhDs teaching military history at colleges around the country. Our goal was to really mentor them and prepare them for the next level, and everything from Clausewitz and World War II all the way to the 21st century war. So, Cameron, thanks for your great insights in that, and thanks for what you'll do in the future as you continue to mentor young Americans. Now, this evening, typically we like to bring in authors and they can sign their book. Cameron's book is forthcoming this fall, but the topic is so timely. We'll have him here, and we'll certainly have him back again. Now, Cameron will speak about his forthcoming book centered around the Montford Point Marines and the crisis of Jim Crow. Now, interviewing Dr. McCoy tonight will be one of our own, our colleague, Dr. John Curatola, military historian with the Museum's Institute as well. John earned his PhD in history from the University of Kansas. He's the author of 2 books, Bigger Bombs for a Brighter Tomorrow. It's about nuclear weapons. and the autumn of our discontent. Now, John's another former Marine officer, 22 years of service. He previously taught at the U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and then went on to teach at SAMS, the Army's elite School of Advanced Military Studies. He's a veteran of multiple military operations, tsunami relief, operations Provide Hope in Somalia, Iraqi freedom. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, join me in a warm welcome for John Curatola and Cameron McCoy. John, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. Thanks for the warm introduction and welcome. This is a fitting place for two Marine officers who are sitting on the stage next to the Eureka boat and a landing craft off to our stage right. And a C-47, or the Marines had D-4Ys during the Second World War. But I think it's also interesting that on stage we probably have half the Marine Corps population of PhDs sitting out here today. I'm just going to throw that out there. Cameron and I had a great conversation this afternoon to kind of preface our discussion tonight on his work. And it's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it. And as I read the manuscript for it, it goes into so many different levels that I did not expect, and it was a phenomenal read, and I'll give it that plug so people can buy it for you. But let me start off, the first question I have for you, Cameron, is what led you to pursue this specific aspect of military history and African-American USMC history?
First, thank you, John, and I want to thank the National World War II Museum for hosting this event. Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you, General Bellin, for being here. Susan, thank you for coming. Dr. Cox, John Paul, Colonel Pastor, and the Marines. I want to first just thank everyone who was able to put this together, for everyone who set everything up, Jeremy and his crew. So thank you to everyone who was able to make this possible, and for you all to have the beverages and food. So thank you to everyone who did that. So that's the first thing I'd like to do. So you ask, well, what happened? I'm a second lieutenant running the endurance course. I'm at infantry officer course, sweltering summer in August. So if you've ever been to Quantico, Virginia in August during the summer, you understand the heat. And while many people always get on me, Stephanie teased me earlier when I told her about me being at 29 pounds. She said, and you said, what's a dry heat? I said, well, so is an oven. And so, I mean, it's still heat. Well, I'm running it. I'm a second lieutenant, and Bobby May, we're running it together, and he stops. And we get to that signpost where you have every single direction arrow telling you how far it is. And he said, Montford Point. And he goes, McCoy, you should know about this. And I was like, what the hell is Montford Point? And he's like, how do you not know this? The first Black Marines. I was like, okay, how did I not know this? And I said, so teach me about it. And he stops and he smiles. He's like, it's about all I know. And so we continue running. And I'm just sitting there thinking all day, how did I not know this? Right? Like, how did I not know this information? And so what it did was I was embarrassed because of it. And it sparked in me an opportunity really to pursue at least this course of military history that I felt, well, you shouldn't be 20-something years old and finding this out. And obviously, you and I know we're much older now, but at 20, you don't know as much as you think. And I had time on my side, at least at that point, I thought I did, getting ready to deploy. But that was what really sparked this opportunity to pursue this course of research.
Well, I can tell you, I thought a lot of things running up and down those hills in Quantico, and I wasn't thinking history as I was running them, I guarantee you. But your book addresses a larger issues that Black servicemen and women faced in the U.S. military. So let's start by addressing, our Marine roots by looking at the Montford Point Marines in this episode of Marine Corps history. Can you give our guests a background on the Marines themselves and their story?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that's very important for us to understand are just the policies that were in place at that time. So FDR at the time, he had issued Executive Order 8802. And what that did was that desegregated all of the defense industries. And that was in June of 1941. During that time, that is when the opportunity opened up for Marines to be able to enlist and join the Marine Corps. Albeit segregated, they still were able to enlist for the very first time in history officially. And the reason I use the word officially is because many people will say, well, there were Black Marines before. Yes, there were, but they were not officially in. And this dates all the way back to the Revolutionary War. And so that's how it started. And this is a funny story, actually. When you ask me about this, I've written my master's degree on this, and this is very pertinent because this was a young man who was the very first Black man in America to take the oath, and his name is Alfred Masters. And I want to make that distinction very clear. And then the second guy was George O. Thompson. But Alfred Masters was the very first to raise his hand and take the oath to enlist in the Marine Corps. And the reason why I know this is because I received an email from his daughter. And she got on me because in my master's thesis, she had thought that I did not recognize him properly enough. And I had talked about Howard P. Perry being the first Marine to don the uniform. And she quickly sent me an email. She sent it like all defensive and smart daughters would do in their father's defense and honor. She sent it straight to the director of the history division for the Marine Corps, and then CC'd me on it. And so I get it, I read it, and she's just saying, hey, this isn't. And so she and I get in touch, and I send her an email, and I say, ma'am, thank you for observing that and making the recommendation. And then I walked her through where I had recognized her dad properly. And she sent me a picture of her father personally from the Masters Foundation and gave it to me and said, I'd like it if you could hold on to this picture. And I asked for it. And so that was very interesting. And back in that time, I'm assuming that really taking on daughters' names, if you didn't have a junior, you'd name your daughter, but her name's Alfreda Masters, right? And the dad's name is Alfred Masters. And so that was a really touching moment for me, even though many people may not believe that, but their story is that critical to have the type of accuracy that it needs to. And so these young men, one thing that I highlight is that they are products of the Great Depression. And it's very difficult for us to understand that time. Employment was scarce at the time. And so they are products of the Great Depression and through the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was somewhat of a semi-military functioning unit for the United States and its national parks. And so these men are coming into a military that is about to enter into a world war, the Second World War, and they are trying to find, it's almost a de facto jobs program for them. But what I did find out and what we talked about a little bit was that these men wanted to serve. They did not care about the obstacles that were around at that time. Segregation and discrimination were not strong enough deterrents for them.
But like any good historian, they go back to look at the root causes of historical events. In your work, you go as far back as the Revolutionary War. But then you fast forward up to what was called the colored troops in the American Civil War, as they were called, and you noted that their desertion rates were significantly less than white soldiers. Can you expand on why that was?
Yeah, they had nowhere else to go. Right? They really didn't, and it may seem trivial to many people when I say that, but the opportunities, again, were scarce. And this is on the heels of emancipation. And so there were not institutions that were readily available to support the needs of an entire community that had been enslaved and had been in bondage. And so they were committed to these dual principles, right, of democracy at home and abroad, right? And they believed that this was the pathway for them to gain full citizenship and not be regarded as second-class citizens or half Americans.
What's interesting, as the Marine Corps starts to assess Black Marines into their ranks, I was struck that you pulled out this interesting letter of instruction from the Marine Corps Commandant that was written in 1943. And I'm going to read a segment for you, then I'm going to ask you to comment on it. And I'm going to start from the bottom and then move up. Okay? In paragraph 8 of the letter that you found, it says, "All Marines are entitled to the same rights and privileges under naval regulations. The colored Marines have been carefully trained and indoctrinated. They can be expected to conduct themselves with propriety and become a credit to the Marine Corps. However, on paragraph 4, it says, and I quote, promotion of colored personnel is authorized in the same manner as applicable to all Marines. In cases where, for example, a colored corporal is qualified for promotion to sergeant, Prior to the time that all white corporals in the unit have been replaced by colored ones, recommendations will be made to this headquarters, and if the recommendation is approved, the man will be transferred to a post where his services will be utilized in the highest manner. The same procedure will follow through all ranks until only colored non-commissioned officers are employed with colored units.
So that letter is what set the standard for formalizing what we call Jim Crow, which comes out on the heels of the Black Codes after slavery. And then this becomes legitimate within society. So this is legal at the time. And I don't want to make light of that, is that for us to understand that at this time, segregation is legal in the United States. And so when these policies are made, and I like to break them down like this, so you have a policy, which then leads to teachings. These teachings turn into attitudes and practices. And so this becomes a practice in the United States to be able to put Black people in their proper place. What that does by default is it creates an attitude that's pervasive throughout all military institutions on how they should treat Black people and what Black people bring to the table. And so this leads into a list that you and I discussed that I'll turn the time over to you, that where you said, hey, I had never known about this list about comportment in public.
In Cameron's book, he very articulately talks about what's called the 7 rules of the Jim Crow South, which, and I'm a historian, I had never heard this. And the 7 rules are this: if you are a Black in the South, never assert or even intimate that a white person is lying. Never impute dishonorable intentions to a white person. Never suggest that a white person is from an inferior class. Never lay claim to or overly demonstrate superior knowledge or intelligence. Never curse at a white person. Never laugh derisively at a white person. And never comment upon the appearance of a white female. And so you see these same ideas are kind of inculcated within Marine Corps ideas and cultures of the time, which is reflective in Commandant Holcomb's letter. You know, how did that strike you when you were going through it and marrying both civilian culture with military culture as in the Marine Corps?
My first reaction was pretty much like yours when you emailed me about a week ago, and you're like, geez, what in the world? But I thought it was applicable, right? Holcomb has a framework a social framework in which he's able to model how comportment should work, right? And for him, and I cannot speak for him, but it looks like through the materials that I used, that he used that as a model to frame his letter of instruction 421. But it's even more than that, because he uses a 1925 Army War College study also to buttress this letter. And in that Army War College study, it really sets a tone of a report by Generals Brown and Ely, who make this report to ensure that they are keeping a full record of Black military performance and contributions all the way from the Revolutionary period through World War I. And what that does is it high marks how military leaders are able, at the highest level, flag officers are able to create a set of rules, a set of standards, and really instructions for their officers to be able to follow and in line. And really this formalizes Jim Crow in uniform.
You also make the point in your book that the Marine Corps officer corps is largely drawn from white Southern gentlemen or males, and so that those cultural manifestations are carried over into their military careers that they learned, in their civilian careers. I thought it was interesting when the authorization is given to actually assess U.S. Blacks into the U.S. Marine Corps. There's that great conversation that goes on that you bring out in your book when it says the comment of Colonel Roger Robinson, USMC, regarding the executive order regarding the accession of Black U.S. Marines, and he says, and I quote, "We got to take in Negroes, and we're just scared to death. We've never had any. We don't know how to handle them, and we're afraid of them." Yeah. Can you walk us through this accession process and how they actually got around to getting these men to Montford Point?
Yes, I mean, one of the things at this point is they're struggling to just, do these men want to even serve? And because of the legacy, I want to go back to 1915 when President Woodrow Wilson was in office, movie Birth of a Nation, which he plays at the White House, and he hosted, and he asserts that it's one of the finest films ever made. And what this does is it really pulls on those 7 concepts we talk about. And what that does is it creates a fear of Black men specifically, right? That they are savages, that they just want white women, they're going to rape them if they ever have an opportunity to. And I mean, and this is 1915, and this is prevalent. I'll use one example from Georgia. I'm saying it incorrectly. And to say it correctly, then say it the way it's supposed to be said. So it's Forsyth County, but it's Forsyth County from anyone who's from Georgia. And I was corrected on that just last week from a young man. One of the things that comes about a young white woman is brutally murdered. And it cost, her life was equivalent to 1,198 Black lives, because that is how many the county pushed out because of the death of her. And so what happens is there's a fear that if Blacks come into any community or any sector, is that they're going to mess things up, that they are not intelligent enough, and that they're just simply savages, that they can't think independently.
I found that interesting too, when you talk about those Montford Point Marines who actually go forward at the Battle of Peleliu as ammunition carriers, and you illustrate the fact that as they're helping out, bringing important Class 5 to their fellow Marines in the fight, that one of the white Marines gives one of these Montford Point Marines his weapon, and he says, "Yeah, cover me or take over." And that Marine never received any combat training. And I was stunned to think that the Marine Corps would put a Marine on a hot beach or an LZ without having any combat training.
It wasn't uncommon. It's interesting how this changes a lot. And at first, during the Civil War, you see Blacks are put in almost every infantry unit, right? Frontline unit, I will say. I won't use the word infantry yet, but frontline unit at that time. And that's because they seem to be expendable, right, to many commanders, not all commanders, but to many. And then the roles change. As the face of combat becomes more lethal, and as the face of combat receives more recognition publicly, then many commanders want to put Blacks in the recesses of combat. They want to push them to the margins, push them to the peripheries. And the reason that's so is so that they are not captured actually defending the country and fighting for the country in a way that demonstrates high bravery, right, and gallantry, because that means the science would be wrong. And that was the problem, is that the science would be incorrect if these men displayed high bravery, high gallantry. And so I don't believe, in my research states, that the Marine Corps has some master plan in keeping them from ever seeing combat or fighting in combat, but there definitely is a push on who would be the poster boys for military recruitment and what that would look like for the United States. And it definitely was not of the darker hue at that time.
And you mentioned in your book, too, that absent in recruiting posters or movies of the time, you don't see Black servicemen. Outside of Dory Miller, Navy Cross winner at Pearl Harbor, you don't see that face, in the recruitment posters at all, to your point. But you also mentioned in your book that the executive order that integrates the military, and your quote is, "It doesn't move the needle." Can you elaborate on that?
All right, so by 1948, President Truman is in office, and he issues Executive Order 9981, and that desegregates the entire U.S. Armed Forces at that point. And when I use the term, "it did not move the needle," my expression of that is it was significant on a legislative level. But in practice, and we talked about these policies, these teachings, then practices, and then attitudes, it just cannot move the needle on all 4 levels at the same time. It can only move the needle on one. And that's just a policy standpoint. But as far as the practices and the teachings and the attitudes, it has no movement at all. And what it does is it starts to infuriate white service members more than anything else. Many blacks who are traveling home on leave in uniform, many get arrested. Police officers think they're impersonating officers, they're impersonating service members. And one of the high point stories, at least this salient feature, really spoke to me. And it really is Truman's response to the incident more than anything else. And that's what Sergeant Woodward, when he gets blinded and he's on a bus and he's just trying to go home and he's in uniform and he's blinded by the police. And when Truman finds this out, I mean, his response is just devastating. Right? And I don't want to use the words that he says, but he just cannot believe it, that something like this could still happen on his watch. And so what that does is it just doesn't move the needle. If anything, this opportunity now opens up for whites without impunity to be able to just attack service members. And really, they're setting a tone of, if you were in uniform, I mean, you use some language that may be strong in, it's just to give effect. Like, hey, boy, if you're in uniform, watch out. That uniform is not going to save you anywhere.
And you also make mention of Sergeant Major Edgar Huff's arrest. He identifies himself at the time as I think it was a corporal or a sergeant of Marines, and the Marine MPs say, I've never heard of that before, and they incarcerate him nonetheless, even though he identifies himself as a serving Marine. But since we talked about the executive order, I'd like you to comment a little bit on the Double V campaign during the Second World War. Success or a failure regarding the issue? I'd like to hear your comments on it.
Can I say ongoing?
That is an excellent answer.
At that time, the pursuit of it was strong, right? And so we understand that there's a 26-year-old aircraft mechanic out of Wichita, Kansas, named James G. Thompson. And he pens a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, which is a prominent black newspaper at the time. And for him, he's really pulling on the strings of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness. And so for him, for Thompson, he's pondering the paradox of fighting for equality abroad while fighting inequality at home. And so as he ponders this paradox, right, he's struck with, should I sacrifice to live half American? Should I sacrifice to be a second-class citizen? And so that's the impetus of the Double V campaign, is for fighting for democracy at home and abroad.
And I think it's interesting to note that one of the founders of the museum, Stephen Ambrose, makes the comment that we go to fight racism with a segregated army. There's an irony there in our policies. Let me ask you another question. How does the World War II experience differ from other wars, like Korea or Vietnam, or even to the contemporary era regarding the black soldier, sailor, airman, Marine experience?
First, I would argue that for all the veterans who fought in every single one of those wars, it's the same, right? The lethality, the brutality is all the same for them. So I don't want to weigh the wars that way. But I will talk about just the evolution of race relations as it works. So it lessens to an extent, but becomes sharper in other ways. So where one door closes, another window opens up. And what I mean by that is, while blacks were allowed in, the equality point becomes contingent on officership. And so now you have sacred spaces that are created. And the officership becomes this very sacred space. Infantry becomes a very sacred space. More specifically, let me say just the combat arms in general becomes a sacred space. And so that's how the transition ends up looking for quite some time. And we see this as a salient feature during Vietnam, where many blacks do not want to serve in the infantry because they're getting killed at a faster rate, at least percentage-wise. And so this becomes a turnoff for many blacks to then serve in combat arms, MOSs, and specifically infantry. And I would argue, you asked me about Desert Storm and Desert Shield. I mean, I just remember, even when I came in, I mean, I'm commissioned in 2003, and black guys did not want to serve in the infantry. I was one of 4 black men in my IOC class out of 34. And I remember people were just like, why are you doing that? Why? And again, I didn't understand why that question was being asked to me as a young man, why people kept asking that. And then I learned about Montford Point. And then I started doing more and more research about it. And so it just evolves in so many different ways. It's not linear. This is not a linear subject. I mean, it's not even circuitous, right? It's very amoebic, and it's difficult to get your arms around. But I think just this tension of not thinking. I remember going to being at the basic school, and I was the only black officer who got WSQ, whatever the highs were. And I remember they were like, "Wait, you can actually swim?" Right? So this becomes one of these things where, yes, I can swim, right? And so these are just tales that make it through time, right? And I don't mean to make light of it, but I thought it was funny as well. Like, yeah, I grew up in a pool. I grew up in the city. Like, yeah, of course I know how to swim, right?
But to that point, you also mentioned in your book, and this really struck me as powerful. You talked about a Marine officer by the name of Joe Biggers, who served during the Vietnam War. But as a black officer, he was not accepted by his contemporaries in the Marine Corps. But then when he went home, he was seen as a sellout to the establishment. And so he found himself a social nomad to a certain extent, or a social, no man's land regarding where did he belong. And it really struck me that how difficult that would be to not be welcomed in either world.
So with Joe Biggers, that was a story that really jumped out to me as well. He goes to Howard University. He's trying to recruit. Again, this goes back to blacks being on the front lines and seeming to be more expendable than their white counterparts. And he goes to Howard University, and they're the nation's at high protest in 1968. And he's back there, and they're just like, get out of here. We're not buying what you're selling. Get out of here. You are a sellout because you want to serve in the white man's war. It's the white man's folly. And so that's what it was. And that's what it was for many people. And I mean, at this time, you got Stokely Carmichael, you got Malcolm X, not about 68, but before. You definitely have MLK by 68, the beginning of 68. And I remember when Joe Biggers goes to Howard, Martin Luther King Jr. had just been assassinated. This set off an incredible and seismic ripple throughout the Marine Corps, and black Marines were not happy about this. They had seen one of their heroes get gunned down. So Muhammad Ali becomes, right, the pivotal figure for many black Marines at that time. So we started to see black nationalism come into play. That makes not just white Marines, it makes other black Marines very nervous at that time. And so everyone's really nervous about this new Negro that shows up and is assertive and is short on patience when it comes to Jim Crow and long on physical endurance and confrontation. And so these are the things that these Marines are competing with at the time. At the same time, right, blacks aren't even recognizing, hey, this young man graduated college, became an officer, and like they can't even see past that because they're so frustrated and fed up with the system at that time.
Let me ask you a personal question here. Do you feel a sense of obligation as a currently serving Marine officer to the Montford Point Marines? Does it still reverberate with you?
It doesn't reverberate with me as much as it probably would someone from Vietnam. how I feel I had an obligation was less through my service and more through education. Put me on the spot, ask me that question. I have a story I want to tell, and I want to share it with you all as a personal story, and then I want to talk about how I feel now as a Black infantry officer in the Marine Corps. And I want to start with first that it evolves over time. My time as a lieutenant, I only was thinking about one thing, and that was learning my job the best I could. That was it. I didn't have time to think about a lot of things. When I got commissioned, the war had started. Before I graduated IOC, I knew exactly what unit I was going to and when I was leaving to Afghanistan. Before graduating, that was nerve-wracking for me. I just had never known that, and on top of that, had to lead. So it evolved. So that was more training. From when I was a captain, I learned how to educate myself more. As a major and now as a lieutenant colonel, it's more about administering and mentoring. So I want to first set that stage there about how I have dealt with that in my own lives. But let me just share a story. 2019, I'm serving down at Southcom in Doral, Florida. And actually, it's when I first met General Bellin as well. And that was a really good opportunity for me. And I show up. I'm working with a Navy 04 lieutenant commander, and he's like, Cameron, people keep looking at you weird everywhere we go. Like, what's up? Like, why does everyone seem so surprised that you're an infantry officer? So in the morning, we're in the elevator, we're going to work, and there's a young sergeant in there and a young corporal. And so I said, just wait a second, Jason. I said, Sergeant so-and-so, and said, how many Black Marine officers have you ever seen? And he says, with my own eyes? And Jason says, you know what, Cameron, never mind. So then I said, wait, no, this conversation's not finished. I said, you're going to learn a lesson today. And I said, how many Black lieutenant colonels have you ever seen? He's like, you're the very first one I've ever seen in my entire career. And he'd been in the Marine Corps for about 8 years at that point in time. And so we got a kick out of that. And then later, and it's a little somber, but I mean, I walked into rooms where, said I'm an infantry officer. Wait, you actually exist? I mean, and to me, it's just, I don't take it as someone's being rude to me, or I just don't, because that's not a healthy way to approach it, right? But I do have an obligation to represent myself well, and I won't let myself down, right? My own name. There are people who believed in me. Right, General Bellin, Colonel Victor Pastor, and others who have believed in me, General Doug Clark, Colonel Quentin Jones, they have believed in me, and I don't want to let them down. And all of these men are not Black, but what I want to do is represent the Marine Corps in the ways that I know how. If I happen to be a torchbearer in this way, so be it. I willingly embrace that. But all 4 of those men I mentioned have embraced me in very intimate ways for my career to move forward and for me to represent, carry on their legacy. I do understand that I carry with me the legacy of the Montford Point Marines in many ways. But again, it has evolved over time. As I've come into the Marine Corps and established myself as a Marine, I understand the evolutionary process that is attached to the origins of the Montford Point Marines, to where I have taken their legacy and moved forward to create my own. And if that creates a wider umbrella for them and people want to attach that to me, so be it. I have absolutely no problem with that. I will not run away from it. There's no end in sight for me running away from that. But I believe I have an obligation to the men who are currently serving that I mentioned to continue to represent the confidence, the pride, and the joy they take in my career and where I am. And I think asking them those questions would be more apt if I'm representing them well.
Wonderful, wonderful. I'm going to ask you one last question before we open it up to the audience. And I think I know the answer already, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Just how emotional was the journey writing this book? And I'm going to ask you as a historian, not as a Marine officer, but as a historian, how did that affect you in the way you constructed your argument? Did you research? Came to your conclusions?
It was very emotional. From every emotion you possibly could have, too. I was angry a lot of times just because I just couldn't believe that other humans could treat other humans that way. That was it. It didn't matter to me the color, but it was just the fact that people were treating other people like this. It was a story of triumph for me as well, especially when I got to the end. And triumph on many different levels. Number one, I was finished with the dissertation. I was finished with the book. So that's the triumph.
A good dissertation is a done dissertation.
Yes, and the relief from that. But I was sad a lot of times that, and I was left with this question. This was a big question, and I know you read it in the conclusion. The one question that still bothers me, and I get it quite frequently, is, and this from a very close friend of mine named Mark Eaker. And I want to thank everyone who has tuned in and streamed live. Thank you for tuning in. Was how many Colin Powells did the Marine Corps miss out on? And that was just sobering for me. I mean, more than anything, that emotion was the most sobering. Was just, my goodness, how many did the Marine Corps miss out on? And none of us will ever know that answer. And so that goes back to your question about how do I feel with the legacy? And I just want to make sure that I am a worthy torchbearer moving forward, and that I can represent those men in ways that they didn't have the opportunity to represent themselves.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those insights.
You represent the Corps, the PhD Corps, and the National World War II Museum very well. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Questions? Don't be shy. General's going to call on you. Right. Oh,
We got two.
General's going to trump you. Yes, sir. Let me bring the mic, please.
I just wanted to mention, since you're currently in the line as an infantry officer, so you're in a greater line for advancement through the ranks. And I think the Corps, you all just promoted your first 4-star general.
Yes, Michael Langley, yes.
Okay.
General Michael Langley, yes.
And that's why I just wanted to make up that point. Make that point. Thanks.
Yes, and one of the things that the Commandant said, David Berger, he said he hopes that this is not the last time. And I know that he's sincere in his words, and I do not, a lot of people may look at it, however they look at it, I don't know, but I definitely do not believe that this was a token measure in any way, shape, or form. I believe that General Langley was completely worthy, well-earned, deserved, and he represents the Marine Corps at the highest level, and everything that is given to him, he definitely earned. And I hope that it's not the last. I hope that we are able to see more generals and those who've actually earned it. Yeah.
What you're seeing is something that we all know, 200,000 Marines, and anybody that had a chance to serve with Dr. McCoy, Cameron McCoy, Lieutenant Colonel McCoy, incredibly proud of him. So get that out of the way. I have a question about the relationship that you may have formed with the families who are now probably 2 generations removed from the Montford Point Marines. And I would love to hear your insights about what they expect of the Marine Corps that their grandfather or great-grandfather enlisted in almost 80 years ago. What do they expect of us now? How can we serve them better now?
No, excellent question, sir. I never even thought about that, even though I have the answer. First and foremost, people stopped calling me because I had a good run of every time I set up a meeting with a Montford Pointer, they died within a week. And so everyone stopped calling me, and they started making fun of me. And so I never had an opportunity to sit down face to face with any Montford Pointer. It was just a very difficult time. But with Sergeant Master's daughter, that was really special. And the most important thing that I recall in our communication was accuracy. All they cared of, again, we have the association here that probably could speak more to that. I just did not have an opportunity to work with. I really was shouldering this by myself, trying to get in as many doors as I could. But it's really difficult, right? Because I learned that the Montford Point associations are protective, right? And they want to ensure accuracy. And so that was the biggest thing that came across to me, sir, was just accuracy and ensuring that the story was told correctly and ensuring that these men are recognized on the same level as Tom Brokaw penned The Greatest Generation, that they truly are worthy of that moniker. Moving forward to today, I don't know what they expect the Marine Corps to do as far as it pertains to how blacks are received or how blacks are promoted nowadays. I think that's a better conversation for General Henderson and General Williamson. I think they could answer that better, sir.
And maybe it's too late for Cameron, but for those of you in the audience, we have probably a dozen or 24 oral histories on our website, worldwar2online.org. So I invite you to go check those out and listen to the individuals in their own words. Next question right here, gentlemen.
Dr. McCoy, I want to echo other comments made. Lieutenant Colonel McCoy, epitome of talent management, 4th Marine Division. So very proud of you and what you're doing.
Thank you,
so
sir.
I greatly appreciate you being here and hosting this. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit about what your research tells us about Black culture from a military perspective. You know, it's good to know about dates and figures, names, but we've seen a lot of pictures, right? So what does your research tell us about the camaraderie within the Montford Point Marines? What is, we often forget about the cultural experience. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Great question. You would think that all these young Black men who are byproducts of the Great Depression would just automatically get along. They did not at all. They did not get along. That was revealing in my research. Southerners did not like Northerners, and Northerners did not like Southerners, right? They thought Southerners were, yes, master, do whatever you say, and everyone from the North was a gangster. So that was the first thing that really jumped out at me during the research. However, once they were in the belly of the beast, when it came to combat, they were all the same. They recognized that. And the culture really starts in World War II and evolves in very quick and acute ways in Vietnam. And I would argue, my argument is from reading New York Times articles during that period, that the Vietnam War is what really produced a stronger culture and still caused division at the same time. So clench power fist greetings, dapping, like just elaborate, all the handshakes and everything you see in the NBA and all that stuff. Like that's what was considered dapping. Some of them could last up to 15 minutes. Yes, absolutely. Retired Lieutenant General Walter Gaskin talks about that. I tell you, he shares a story where he used to have to come into the chow hall when he was the officer of the day and break things up because they'd be holding up the line to get food. So that really ends up bringing out a big culture. And so you have two camps by Vietnam. You have the Black nationalists who side with Stokely Carmichael, who's also known as Kwame Ture, and Malcolm X, and then those who side with Martin Luther King Jr. And then there's a smaller group that I found. They're careerists. And these are the ones who are called Uncle Tom, sellouts, who are just focused on their career, and they just believe that all of that just invited trouble. And so it was tough for me to delineate that there was a specific culture that emerged, but definitely Black nationalism emerged. I mean, it really had a strong sprint for a long time, sir, and that was what I found. All of them respected Martin Luther King Jr.'s message and the way he wanted to push things, but they really liked Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. They just really liked those models of strength. And so for them, it came down to just displaying strength.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Cameron McCoy and Dr. John Curatola. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
So, Cameron, we're looking forward to your book release later this year, and certainly future opportunities to bring you right back here to engage some more. For the audience, please mark your calendars for February 23rd. We'll host our next General Raymond D. Mason Distinguished Lecture featuring Dr. Thomas Guglielmo, who will be presenting on his award-winning book titled Divisions, A New History of Racism and Resistance in America's World War II Military. So I know you'd mentioned part of that. Tonight, the museum is also showing Fly, a play that tells the story of 4 African-American Tuskegee Airmen and their fight on 2 fronts to achieve the double victory, the Double V campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against Jim Crow and discrimination at home. So if you purchase tickets for tonight's showing of Fly, please make your way across the street to the stage door canteen. The museum also is offering discount tickets for everyone here tonight. So if you want to do that, go for it. I encourage you to do that. If you haven't purchased tickets, they'll be available at the door. And last but not least, I'd like to give one last shout out. Thank you to Dr. Cameron McCoy for being here tonight. Thanks, everybody.